Open your Bibles, if you would, to Daniel chapter 3. I'd like to study a familiar passage of Scripture with you this evening. Hope it'll be of some profit to you. Happy to have you. Appreciate you being here. Good to see our visitors. And I'm encouraged by your presence. Hope you're encouraged by being here this evening. Daniel chapter 3. This is a story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as you've probably already suspected from the Bible reading. Let me say this prior to reading this chapter. I'm going to read this chapter with you. This story in the book of Daniel is very often relegated to kids' stories. It is entertaining. Kids love it. I don't know how many pictures I've seen in storybooks through the years, and you have as well. And there is something dashing and daring and incredible about the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But I want you to remember this as we read through it and as we make a couple of observations from this story this evening. This was not written for kids. This story was written for adults. Adults in difficult circumstances. The children of Israel are in captivity. When this story takes place, we don't know how long they've been in captivity. The previous chapter, it's the very early stages of captivity. Jerusalem hasn't been destroyed yet. The temple's not been burned down. The walls haven't been torn down. Most of the population of Israel, of Judah, are still back in the homeland. But when we get to chapter 3, we really don't know how far along in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar this is. And by the time Nebuchadnezzar has died, the children of Israel are in a very oppressive, many ways, a very oppressive captivity. And the story is intended to inspire them to keep their faith in God. And so as we read this, and we tend to kind of smile knowingly because we all know the story and how it goes, and we all know what the points are to be made. Please remember that God's writing to His people that are living in the midst of a very ungodly world. And this is why this kind of jumped out at me. This has been a part of our scripture reading in the past week. And as I got to thinking about it while I was reading it the other day, I thought how appropriate for the world in which we live. 1 Peter chapter 2 talks about the fact that we are God's people, a chosen people, a royal nation, a holy people, and we are to show forth the praises, as David's already noted in his prayer, we're to show forth the praises of Him who called us out of darkness and into light. And sometimes I think we don't relate these stories to our circumstances, and yet we are a people living in the midst of a very ungodly world under a government that could very easily become oppressive. And so read this story with me and let me make a couple of observations for the adults in the audience. Daniel chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits, about 90 feet, and its width 6 cubits, about 9 feet. And he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together all the satraps and the administrators and the governors and the counselors and the treasurers and the judges and the magistrates and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps and the administrators and the governors and the counselors and the treasurers and the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship will be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, and lyre, and symphony with all kinds of music, all the people and nations and languages fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews, and they spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image that I have set up? Now if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image that I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you will be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury. The expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men who were bound in their coats and their trousers, their turbans and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the middle of the fire? And they answered and said to the king, True, O king. Look, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. The form of the 4th is like the Son of God or a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. And the satraps, administrators, governors, the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, nor was the smell of fire on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. And the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. We could spend a lot of time talking about this story. There's some really interesting things here. The way that it's written, I haven't counted how many times they say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but when you read it out loud, it will be exhausting by the time you get to the end of the chapter. And the description, okay, when you hear the sound of this, and I think the point of all that is probably this is written in the form of a kind of an official document, kind of an official record. And we could make some really interesting arguments from that, but here's a couple of things I want you to recognize that you may not think about when you read this story, especially as it relates to our circumstances. And the first one is this. We shouldn't expect human government to resolve or arrest moral decay. And you think, well, how in the world do you get that out of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Well, go back to the end of the last chapter. The last chapter is when Nebuchadnezzar has his dream, and None of his wise men can tell him the dream, and so he doesn't trust their interpretation. And finally, Daniel comes forward, who's very young. This is only in Nebuchadnezzar's second reign, so Daniel and these young Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are probably teenagers at this point. And if you remember, Daniel tells him the dream and then explains the dream. At the end of chapter 2, there's an interesting turn of events. Verse 46, King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face prostrate before Daniel and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. And he said, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. So the king promoted Daniel, gave him great gifts, made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, chief administrator of the wise men. And Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province. I want you to appreciate that Nebuchadnezzar's in a kind of unique circumstance, as we have been told about foreign leaders and how they interact with God's people. In fact, as you read through Daniel, you can almost get the impression that Nebuchadnezzar becomes an okay guy, especially when he has his dream about going crazy and Daniel's reluctance to tell him that dream. I don't know if Daniel develops an affection for him. Over and over and over, we see that Nebuchadnezzar offers some kind of praise to God, an appreciation for God's power. He does so at the end of this event, after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are delivered. And praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nobody says anything about their God. And so you see all this impact as you read through Daniel about God's people and the impact that they have upon this king. And yet, here's what I want you to appreciate. Here's a man that clearly has some interaction with God on a level that most people never would. And God makes a point of showing him his power. In fact, you might parallel Nebuchadnezzar in some ways with Pharaoh and his interaction with Moses. By the time Moses and God are finished with Pharaoh, Pharaoh knows that Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, is the God. Well, you could make that same argument, I think, probably for Nebuchadnezzar. And yet, as the chapter begins, Nebuchadnezzar's setting up an image, a golden image, this huge, tall, I want to think of it as a monolith, but the more I read it, the more I'm kind of convinced that maybe this is an image that's intended to represent Nebuchadnezzar himself. Because it's always described as an image, not just as a pillar. And it's set in contrast or next to the gods of Nebuchadnezzar. And what he's telling all of his subjects to do is, you got to worship my gods. And he may actually be going so far as to say, you've got to worship me. Notice that when the three young men defy him and they bring him before Nebuchadnezzar in verse 17, or verse 18, verse 15, who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Well, which is quite a challenge to a God that he's already recognized as having tremendous power. What's more, this is a brutal sentence that this man who has been exposed to God now offers. He is a man who recognizes the power of God, and yet, when somebody doesn't do what he wants them to do, he's going to throw them into a furnace. And if you understand, if you've ever seen a picture of these kiln furnaces that they had, huge round furnaces that taper up to the top into almost a funnel. Okay, and so they throw them in from the top. All the heat is rising out. The doors are at the bottom, and that's how they can see the men inside without themselves being destroyed. I mean, who thinks of this? You do what I want you to do. I'm not just going to kill you. I'm going to kill you in such a way. It's going to hurt all the way down. Furthermore, this man is ruthless. It's only going to be about 10 years, and that's if this happens early in his reign. We don't know, is this within a few months, within a couple of years, or is this towards the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign? We really don't know. But it's only going to be a few years before Nebuchadnezzar finishes the destruction of Jerusalem, finishes the captivity of Judah. And he is described in several places. Jeremiah chapter 6, Jeremiah chapter 39, Jeremiah chapter 51, Jeremiah chapter 52. If you go back and you read those chapters, God describes for the children of Israel both what Nebuchadnezzar's going to do and what Nebuchadnezzar did do to his people. And it's harsh. And God tells them, this is a cruel people that's coming on you. And they're not going to spare anybody. They don't care if you're young. They don't care if you're old. They don't care if you're a woman. They don't care if you're with child. They are going to come and they are going to absolutely brutalize you and destroy you in ways you could not possibly imagine. And they're going to besiege your city and you're going to starve to death, and they're not going to care at all. In fact, when they actually finally break into the city and the king Zedekiah tries to escape, they catch Zedekiah, they bring him to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar kills all of his sons before his eyes and then puts his eyes out and puts him in chains and hauls him off to Babylon, and then goes to city and burns his house and burns all the houses, and then comes back a few months later and destroys the temple and carries all of the golden artifacts from the temple off to Babylon. He is a brutal, ruthless, cruel man who knows who God is, who knows what God can do, who has experience with God in ways that you and I never will. Before Nebuchadnezzar, he is a man given to great pride. When you get over a couple of chapters to chapter 4, chapter 5. Chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar is going to be lifted up with pride. God's going to send another dream to him. And the dream is of a great tree that gets cut down and eventually grows again. And the dream basically says, Nebuchadnezzar, I've given you all this stuff, and you're going to become too proud, and I'm going to cut you down. And what appears to be the case is he has a kind of a mental breakdown, thinks that he's an ox, and spends 7 months, weeks, years, we don't really know exactly what the 7 refers to, living out in the pasture eating grass. And his sense returns to him, and he praises God. But before he is done, he is brutal to God's people. I want you to think about the world we live in for a minute. I want you to think about our government and how much confidence we sometimes put in the changes that government takes place in the United States of America. There's more conservative people in office. There's less conservative people in office. There's people who make overtures towards knowledge of God. There are people that clearly just dismiss God. And I tell you, I think it's a dangerous thing. When we start thinking things are all going to be okay in our lives going forward because now we have a government that acknowledges God, that understands something about God, that has some kind of quote-unquote belief in God. Do you realize that men have lived under governments where the leaders somehow or the other acknowledge God for centuries and centuries and centuries, and those governments are not what's going to change the world for good? It's going to be us. It's going to be the people that stand up in the midst when the king becomes an ungodly king. And I think we need to appreciate that secular government is that's not our white knight riding in to lead us all to a better life. And it scares me because that's the direction I have seen our country go over the last several decades. Didn't work out too good for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or the Jews. And so, first observation I would make is we need to be really careful that we don't think that human government is the solution. And that being said, the second observation I would make is no matter what human government does, and no matter how much human authority might abuse its power, God still expects loyalty from His people, which is really the main point here. It's not so much about deliverance as it is about loyalty. When you get to chapter 6, you remember the other story that is famous from Daniel, and that's Daniel in the lion's den. And I want you to appreciate it is the same story. That God expects His people to stand up when they are abused, when they are confronted, when they are oppressed, when the world goes against them, when human authority turns against them, and He still expects His people to be loyal. And I find it interesting when you look at Daniel 3, to stop and think for a few minutes about these three men. Back in chapter 2, they've been placed in position of leadership. They are made the rulers over the province of Babylon. And you'll notice that when they are accused in the story in verse 8, that it's some of the Chaldeans come forward, some of the Babylonians, and they tell Nebuchadnezzar, hey, these Jews that you've placed in these positions of influence, they're not playing ball the way that you've asked them to play ball. And so Nebuchadnezzar calls them in and gives them an opportunity. I want you to think about the first time that the music sounds. Here they are in the plain of Dura, and they're, from the account, have to be literally thousands of people there. And here's this huge statue, and the music starts, and everybody's supposed to bow down. When everybody around you bows down, it's kind of hard to miss the people that don't bow down. How easy compromise would have been for those guys. I don't know if they were married, but let's just say for argument's sake they had families. They're already in a position of great influence, which for the Jews must have been a kind of a feather in their cap. Here is an oppressive nation that's taking over, and yet look up there in the government. We've got some of our people up there. Don't you know it was inspiring some of the Jews that maybe this captivity that's coming is not going to be so bad. We've got people on our side in positions of great influence. Well, you don't want to lose that. If you've got a family, you don't want to be cast in a furnace, in a burning fiery furnace, and leave your family to just whatever happens to them. And on top of that, the kind of standing that they have in the community. I mean, just who wants to die, especially by being burned to death? How easy it would have been among all these people to bow down and nobody know. That's the dilemma they faced. How many dilemmas like that have you faced? Have I faced? I mean, how many Christians are you going to be around this week in your work? Are you working with people that know you, and if you waffle a little bit, they're going to go, hey, wait a minute. You're supposed to be serving the Lord. Or is it easy to get lost? I think of the kids. I mentioned some to the kids this morning, the young people, about the kind of opportunities that you have to bring people to the Lord, that you're stewards to. How easy it is when you're a young person to compromise, to just kind of go with the flow and hope nobody will notice, and then to justify that. Well, you know, if I stand up, all my friends are going to dump me, and then how can I be an influence on them? And we all make those kinds of arguments. God expects loyalty. And that's the point of these stories. Daniel is loyal, even though it's going to cost him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are loyal, even though it's going to cost them. You see this theme repeated over and over, especially in the early days of Acts when the gospel's going into the world and the apostles are preaching in Jerusalem and they're being called on the carpet by the leaders and they bring them in and they beat them and they tell them, don't go, you can't preach this anymore. And they turn right around and they go back and preach it again. Then they get cast into prison, and if it's not for Gamaliel, they're going to be killed. And they're still going and preaching. There is no compromise with them. And there can be no compromise with us. I recognize that that's a pretty simple point. The question is, are we practicing it? Think about the influence that you can have by standing up. By showing your loyalty to God when everything around you says, hey, just give in. Don't make problems. Don't make problems at work. Don't make problems at school. Don't make problems in your community. Just give in. You're never going to have influence if you're identified as an insurrectionist. And that's the dilemma that they faced. And what God expected of them was to stand up. And they did. And do you see what happened? They had influence on Nebuchadnezzar. And they had influence on all the Babylonian people around them. And they had influence on the Jews. And they still have influence on us. And that's what God expects of us. Observation number 3. Those kind of decisions about moral dilemmas and expressing our faith, they can't hinge on deliverance. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego make the observation to Nebuchadnezzar, look, our God can deliver us, but if He doesn't, so be it. They're not making their decision based upon the fact that, okay, we know what's going to happen. God's going to throw us in, they're going to throw us in His fire, and God's going to deliver us. There's no reason for them to believe that. Nothing like this has ever happened before. They know God has that power. And God reminds us regularly of the kind of control that He has, His ability to deliver us. It is the focal point of Daniel, and it's an important principle for us, folks. How are we going to be light in this world if we compromise with the religious pollution of our day? How are we going to be light in the world if we compromise with the immorality of our day? How are we going to be light of the world if we start worshiping like everybody else does, talking like everybody else does, dressing like everybody else does, thinking like everybody else does? How are we ever going to truly be the people God wants us to be if we compromise? And just because God tells us that He is in control doesn't mean He's going to deliver us from difficulty. He didn't deliver Job. There's an interesting character, by the way, in the story of Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 26, Jeremiah is told to go and deliver a message to the children of Israel, or the children of Judah, about the Babylonians. And basically the message is, if you want to save your life, you need to desert. You need to just give yourself over. You need to leave the city and go turn yourself into the Babylonians. If you do that, you'll save yourself. And they become enraged at Jeremiah. Throw him in prison. And some of the nobles actually stand up for him and say, look, you know, Micah, he said the same thing years ago, and nobody killed him. We need to appreciate that God's speaking through him. And so Jeremiah is delivered. But in the middle of that story, Jeremiah chapter 26, beginning in verse 20, we're also told about another prophet named Urijah. And Urijah had the same mission, same message. And we're told that Jehoiakim the king becomes so enraged by what Urijah does that he tries to have him killed. And Urijah escapes and he goes to Egypt. And Jehoiakim's so mad at him that he sends his henchmen. They catch him in Egypt. They bring him back. And it appears, if you read the account, that possibly Jehoiakim himself killed the prophet of God. Now here's the point. We all want to think we're Jeremiah. That if I actually stand up and I have to deal with difficulty, that God's going to save me. We might be Urijah. Or Stephen. Or James, the brother of John. Or Jesus. Our faith, folks, has to be in God, not in deliverance. And we're living in a wicked world. And just because there's a regime change doesn't mean it's all going to be okay. And we'd best prepare ourselves. Which brings me to the last observation, and it is the interesting one, that while God may not deliver us from the circumstances, He will not desert us. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get thrown into the furnace. And Nebuchadnezzar and his officials are looking into that kiln. And Nebuchadnezzar can't believe his eyes. Hey, didn't we cast 3 guys in there bound? Why do I see 4 guys in there walking around? And one of them looks like probably what he is saying is a son of the gods. In other words, he doesn't look like the normal human being. And later describes him as the angel of God. The point of that is, in the midst of the furnace, God's still with us. That God knows what's going on in our lives, that God knows when we're suffering, that when God tells us, look, don't be afraid of people in the world. If you're going to be afraid of anybody, be afraid of me. That's what He tells them in Matthew 10 or Luke chapter 12. That's what He tells His apostles. Tells them to go take what they've heard in the ear and preach it on the housetops. And God cares for you. God knows the very numbers of the hair on your head. You need to appreciate that God is with you. And you may suffer and you may die and it may be terrible, but it doesn't mean that God deserts us, because God's looking at the big picture. Don't judge God's loyalty by the circumstance of our life. Now, those are simple little things. And I recognize that this is stuff that we're familiar with and that we've all heard before. But look around. Are we progressing? Is the cause of Christ marching across the United States of America and just bringing people in droves? You know, it's a wicked world we live in. Jesus calls Satan the prince of the world, and he still is. And he's still winning. And while we've seen maybe some conservative shifts in politics in our country in the last couple of weeks, look at the world in a bigger picture. There's a lot of ungodliness and immorality out there. There's a lot of ungodliness and immorality in our nation. And more we are the minority. We're the people like the Jews in captivity. And we're going to be tested, just like Daniel was, and just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were. And I think it's time we kind of take this out of the kids' realm and appreciate that this applies to us. So I hope I give you something to think about. We can't stick our heads in the sand and just roll with it and think it's all going to get better. We have to be the people that stand up when the music sounds. And so God help us to do so. Thanks for your attention tonight. Hope I give you something to think about. If you're subject to the invitation, if you need to make your life right with God and we can help you, we invite your response while we stand and sing.